Hey there, Dangar Stu here. Today's video is going to be on a bit more rope work type stuff. Specifically, I guess the aim of this was to talk about knots and when to use them, and maybe a little bit sort of on how to use them. I guess the idea was that there's lots of information on tying knots, lots of videos, books, apps. Actually, I think it's the best way, to be honest with you, if you've got access to a smartphone or something like that. But there isn't always a lot of information on the sort of the context. I've learned how to tie a bowline, I've learned how to tie a sheepshank, whatever. When and how do I use it? So that's what this video is about. So one thing I'll say up front, in case you're looking at learning how to tie these knots, is this video is not aiming to teach you knots. I'll be tying them, but I won't be tying them slowly and showing you each step. What I will do is show you the app I think is the best way to learn knots from. It's called Knots 3D. I don't have any affiliation with this app, I just particularly like it. And so I'll point you to that if you want to go and actually learn how to tie these knots. So don't beat me up for not going through them slowly enough. I'm not trying to teach how to tie them, just when and why you might tie them. So I hope that makes sense. Anyway, let's get going. What I'll do is I'll start with the bowline. It's probably one of the the most common boating knots around. Great knot for doing all sorts of things. But what I'll do is I'll show you a bit of a shortcut if you are tying it, and also how to undo it. So I guess I'm trying to show all the sort of peripheral things about knots other than the core technique for tying it. So here's the mighty green machine. It's my tinny, tied off the back here, just with a bowline around this post. One thing before I move on I'll say, somebody asked me the other day how that motor I rebuilt is going, and that Yamaha on the back there is that outboard I rebuilt right at the beginning of this whole YouTube channel. Still going strong. I use it every day. There's no way for me to get to work without using this boat, so that motor is still going quite strong, if anyone was ever wondering. Anyway, back to knots. So the thing about a bowline is that you can tie it on, it can have quite a lot of force. This can be a bit of rough weather. The knot can be pulling against this pole for a week on end. It won't come undone, but when you want to undo it yourself, you can get it undone. And that's generally the idea behind many knots. It's not that they hold. Plenty of knots will hold. They always say if you can't tie knots, tie lots. It won't come undone, but a bad knot will lock and you'll have a lot of trouble getting it undone. So I'll show you how you undo a bowline. So one of the limitations I will say about a bowline is that it's great if there's, if there has been tension on the line, but it's quite difficult to undo them if there still is tension on the line. If something's hanging on off this, so for example, if you tie a boat, the tide goes out and your rope goes taut, it's quite hard to undo these. So we'll look at knots that are good to undo while the tension's still on it. That's not a property of a bowline. Anyway, so great knot for tying up, and all you do is you can see with the bowline there's this loop at the back. Hope I can get a good camera angle on that. This loop just gets pushed backwards, and as soon as that's back you can pull this rope through and it's quite easy to get undone. Often you hear it called sort of breaking the back of the knot. So it's just, I'll tie this one again, I'll try and show you a different angle. So it's the final loop when the knot's still quite loose. It's this loop that comes round the main part of the rope going to the boat. So you pull it tight, and then all you need to do is take that bit and bend it back down here. And then this is the part going off to the boat, and then you can pull that because it's no longer locked up. This was sort of the brake, I guess you'd call it. So you're basically taking that brake off, pulling it through, and you can collapse it. So that's undoing a bowline, particularly if it's been under a lot of tension and it's really locked up. You won't always need to do that if it hasn't been under tension, but if it has, that's the trick to unlocking it. So another trick you'll see with bowlines is in the tying of the knot. So you'll often see it as, do a loop, little rabbit comes out the hole, round the tree, back in the hole. And that's how it's tied, that is the actual end result. But once you get familiar with that, you can do it a bit quicker by laying this rope over the top, and then you just give it a twist, and you actually make your loop and have the rope coming out in one action. So go through the app stuff. I've got to show you the app yet. I'll do that straight after this knot. So in this case I've got it so that the standing part's in my left hand, the end here in my right. So I just go over and then flip it round like that. Hopefully you can see that. There we go. So you end up with the loop and the rope coming through in one sort of quick twist. So that's just a bit of a trick with the bowline, above and beyond learning to tie the basic knot. Either way, it'll end up looking exactly the same. It's just a quicker way of tying it. So this app, I hope you can see this, is called Knots 3D. It's got a whole lot of categories for knots. So if we go into the boating category, and here's the bowline we just saw. So you'll get a kind of an animation on tying it. So you can kind of see where it all goes. And at any stage you can pause that. You can rotate it through different angles if you want to see it from the back. You can also rotate it this way. You can change the speed that it ties it at. You can pause at any time so you can see a little bit, play it, pause it. Go into a full screen of just the knot itself. So I think it's a really good way to learn a knot. I actually think it's quite hard. Sometimes someone shows you a video like I just did, and you sort of see it, your brain tries to cope with it, and it's hard, you know, it really is. So I think if you're going to teach yourself knots, an app like this is a really, really good way to do it. And that's why I'm not really trying to teach the core tying of knots in this video. I think, honestly, an app like this is just gold when it comes to learning knots. But at the same time, as I said, it doesn't teach you anything about the context of using them, and that's what we're doing today. So an eye like this is good for putting on the cleat of a boat. There's every chance it'll stay, but it's not that hard to get off if the boat's sort of rocking around. So when you're using an eye like this, it's also good just to put a little bit of a turn in it. If you put a turn like that, as the boat pulls, it actually constricts around the shaft of the cleat here, and much less chance of it coming off. Also, ideally, the base of a cleat is always the strongest part, so it's always good to have a turn around the base before you do anything with the rest of the cleat, depending on the style of it. And this is also a reason that when you're splicing an eye on a rope, that you make the eye a little bit bigger. Don't make a small eye like that just fits over. I mean, you can do in the sense that that's less likely to fall off, but a bigger eye is a lot more versatile. So a similar thing goes for cleats like this. I think they're staghorn cleats? I can't remember. I've got a shocking memory for names and things. But if I take a loop like this, best way to use these cleats if you want to secure permanently with an eye, or permanently but securely, is just to come up and over and around like that. And that way that's not going to fall off. Once again, trouble with this is if this is under constant tension, you won't get it off again. So like many knots, one of its strengths is also one of its weaknesses. You want to get this undone under tension later on. Always sort of take a turn around the base of a cleat, because where this rope first comes to the boat is the point of the highest stress. Every part of the rope that's coming around this cleat has got less and less stress on it compared to this very first part. So you want this to pull on the strongest part of a cleat. You don't want it pulling on the horns here. But once it's through, you can sort of just do your figure of eights. And the advantage to this is if you have enough turns, it won't actually pull, even without doing a little locking turn like that, where you tuck it under like a half hitch. It won't pull, but at the end of the day, you will be able to undo this. You'll start to, I undo it if it's under tension still. Once you get enough turns off, it'll start to slip. So if you still got a couple of turns, you can hold this and sort of belay the tension a little bit. But rather than putting the loop through by cleating off with figure eights, you will be able to get it undone, even if there was a heavy weight hanging off here. So another really common thing to want to do with knots is to join one rope to another. Now the classic knot for doing this is a sheet bend. They often describe a sheet bend as being good for connecting ropes of dissimilar diameters. So a thick rope to a thin rope. Now that's a bit of a strength of it, but it doesn't mean the opposite. You can't use it to tie two ropes of equal diameter. Traditionally you see a reef knot used for that kind of thing, but to be honest with you, I'm not a big fan of reef knots. They're good for things like tying up sail covers, reefing sails, where the name comes from. But I don't know, they tend to behave a bit strangely based on which way they're being pulled, and if they're done incorrectly, they can literally just fall apart. Not that that's, you know, an argument against a knot. You know, if you do it wrong, you've done it wrong. But I have had it heard that, you know, no knots kill more people than a reef knot, you know. So I tend to prefer a sheep end for almost all connecting of rope to rope. Now, a sheep end, once again, I'll let you kind of, you know, look it up on an app or a book or whatever to tie it. But it essentially gives you something very, very similar to a bowline, in that what you end up with is the thicker rope here is going around here, and it gives you that back, that lock that you can undo. So if ever you have to undo a sheep bend after it's had tension, approach it much in the way you would undoing that, that bowline. Also, you can, another thing to be aware of is that the thicker rope should be the one that just has a simple loop, and the thinner rope is the one that's doing the undertucks, so that's something to be aware of. If you're looking at a book, it doesn't necessarily tell you which one to do where. What else do you need to know about this rope? So the other thing is you can do double sheep ends where you give it sort of extra tucks and do things like this if you don't want it to come undone. The other thing I occasionally do is leave longer tails, and you can then just put some half hitches in the other ends if you really want to secure it and keep it so that it won't come undone. But a really good knot to know. Now, another way you can join two ropes together is to simply tie a bowline in one, which will give you a loop, and then through that loop just tie a second bowline. So the thing about that, I guess, is that it ends up with quite a bulky, not particularly attractive pair of knots. But if you're really good at your bowlines and you don't know a sheep bend, and you need to join two ropes together in a way that you can get undone but won't come undone, it's an option, just something to be aware of. So a whole other class of knot work is hitches. So hitches, I guess, you know, they're a type of knot, but maybe not technically, I don't know. And one of the things I really like about them is, particularly things like a clove hitch, is they're really good at positioning something accurately. So when you tie a bowline, you tend to have a bit of slack in the line, and when you let the line go, it'll fall into a different place. Whereas a hitch is good for things like a fender. So if you're putting a fender on a boat, there's not a lot of strain on it. You're not really expecting it to come undone. If you do lose a fender, it's not the same as losing your tender, things like that. So they're not as secure as other knots like bowlines, but they do allow you to accurately position things. So I'll show you that, particularly in the context of putting a fender on a boat. So the fenders for this boat actually already have permanent spliced lines and everything. So I'm just going to use this little one. So the first step is to attach a line to it, and because it's got an eye, there's a lot of knots you can do, but to me the obvious thing is just put a bowline through here. So I'll quickly just put a bowline through the end here. I'll use this fraying end of rope. Should have brought better rope for a rope video, you would have thought anyway. And then we'll look at the hitch for the other end. So, quick bowline through there. And then all I'm going to do here is drop it overboard, and I might decide that I want it to sit exactly where the sponson is, because that's where it's going to hit. And so if I was to then tie a bowline here, I'd need to do this, I'd need to twist, I'd put some slack in it, and exactly the position that it ends up in, up or down, is not as easy to place. So I'll just put this camera down and I'll show you what we do instead. Before you could see, I was just running the rope over, up and down to get the positioning of the cleat where I want it. And I'll lower this right down just so I can get to the end here. Having a rope in the ballpark with your fenders does make things easier. But once I've got the exact position I want, if I do a clove hitch, all I need to do is wrap it over and under, and I've got my position. So I started with the rope in position, and then I never had to move that to do the clove hitch. That piece of rope stayed exactly at that spot. So it's a really good hitch for starting in a position and knowing that by the time the knot's moved, you haven't moved a millimetre on that particular knot. So that's a really big strength of this particular hitch. Positioning something exactly, getting it right, then doing the hitch. Now while we're here on a rail, I'll show you another sort of railing type hitch, I guess you'd call it. Yeah, so the knot's actually called a round turn and two half hitches, so I guess it's I don't know what it is. A knot with a hitch, a turn with a hitch. So what it is essentially is you're just taking a rope and you're doing a round turn. So essentially you're going across around and back down. And then all you have to do is take the rope and do a hitch, and then do a second hitch. So you can see there, hopefully, yep, in view. Round turn, one hitch, and a second hitch. So interestingly, if you're into knots, otherwise not interestingly, 2 half hitches is actually a clove hitch. So when we did a clove hitch on here, on this, essentially what we've done now is taken this part of the rope and done a clove hitch onto the rope itself. So the thing I like about this knot is it's pretty strong, but once again, as I was saying with the cleat, most of the tension is taken up in the first place the rope touches the thing you're attaching to. So in this case, this little bit of rope here comes up, that's where most of the tension is. Then by the time it's done a second turn, there's a bit less. By the time you've done one hitch, there's a little bit less again. By the time you get to the last hitch, even though I'm pulling on this rope, it's not that tight. So this is one of those ropes you've got half a chance of getting undone, even whilst it's actually still under pressure. I'm not saying it's always going to be easy, but it is possible that you can get that undone when it's taut. Now, a slight variation on this knot is what's called the Anchor Hitch. It's where you start off with the same round turn, but instead of just going straight into your hitches here, through here, you actually go through here, through that main loop, and then you do another hitch here. And this is really just designed to be a slightly more permanent. As you can kind of tell, I guess, from an anchor hitch, it's where you might attach a rope to a ring that's in the final link of the anchor chain, and you want it to stay for a fairly long time. So it's not a knot you're looking to do and undo, it's something you're looking for that extra bit of security. One thing I will say though, is if you're going to do this sort of thing where ropes attach permanently to metal, particularly something a bit rougher like gowel rather than stainless, which is quite smooth, and something that's underwater and it's going to be moving constantly, chafing a little bit, is you're better off splicing and putting a thimble inside. I don't have one here, but I'll get a photo of a thimble later and show you. Otherwise, the metal can actually chafe through the rope. So although this is designed to be permanent and was used in the days as an anchor hitch, just be aware that you will eventually wear through this rope if you tie it permanently to a bit of rough metal and there is constant movement. Something I don't read much about, but I do occasionally if I'm a bit paranoid about a knot. And it should hold, but if you're a little bit worried about it, this is the end you're worried about coming out. So on any knot, I also find that occasionally I'll just undo the layer of the rope a little bit and just poke that loose end through. That way you've got the knot doing all the holding, because this is where the tension's coming in, but you've just got this this end, bitter end, standing part, I should look that up, secured, and to me it just adds a little bit of extra security to the knot. It's not hard to do, doesn't really do any harm. It depends on situation, of course. You know, is this eye need to be running freely? This is obviously going to be in the way. I find it works a little bit better if you can get this on the main rope here, because then as the tension comes, it's trying to pull the layer of the rope back together and actually clamps down on this end. But it also affects the orientation with a bowline. Works better, I think, with things like that anchor hitch, but just a technique to have a play with. See if it feels like makes your knot a little bit more secure when it needs to be. So I just looked it up, and the bitter end is the end you're working with, essentially, the bitter end of the rope, and then the standing end's the other end that goes to whatever. But this is kind of the part of the knot. So yes, it's tucking the bitter end in if you want to make the knot a little bit more secure. So the next knot we'll look at is a stopper knot. Stopper knots are pretty common in sailing, but the general idea is when a rope passes through an aperture like this, like an eye, or in this case it's just a bit of a freeing port, you tie it. So much like your simple overhand knot, which is just like that, about the simplest knot you can do. It goes over, but instead of coming up through, it just goes back down. Makes a figure of 8 like this. But the idea behind this knot is if this rope runs free, the rope won't pull through. So it's most commonly used in sailing for your main sheets, where it'll go through an eye, then go into a cleat. So when you're tacking and you undo the sheet, the rope will run free, but instead of running all the way through, it'll run till its end where the stopper knot will hold it. So that's the situation. If ever you've got a rope or a line passing through something, and you don't want it to pull through, put a stopper knot on the end. So the last knot I'll show you is the Highwayman's Hitch. To do this, as I said, I won't show you in detail because there's better ways to learn knots than my videos. But what you end up with is a line like this that can be pulled quite tight, and the knot won't come undone. So you could tie, this end would be going off to like a small tender or something, you can tie it to the boat, and it's reasonably secure. Not a knot I would leave unattended for any length of time though. I wouldn't leave it overnight, for example. Now, the advantage of this knot is this working end can be as long as you want, and all you need to do is pull this working end and the whole knot will collapse. So what that allows you to do is undo the knot quickly. It's good for undoing quickly if you need to. It's also particularly good for releasing a knot remotely, like I do in the raising a radar reflector up the backstay. In that case, I tie onto the reflector. The reflector goes all the way out the backstay, out of reach, and then I use this remote line to disconnect the rope so the reflector stays up and the rope comes back. So it's good for that remote disconnection, and it's also good for impressing girls. So I think that's all I want to go through for today. There is a whole sort of bit of rope work around towing another boat, but I think I'm going to do a separate video just on towing a boat because there is a bit of other information that goes with that, and I think it stands alone nicely. But I think these are the most common ones I use. Bowline's really good for tying a loop in a rope, and that loop can pass through something. You don't need to have an open end, so you can pass the end through, tie your bowline. So good for tying around a post, through a ring, all that kind of stuff. Easy to get it out, get it undone once it's been under pressure, not so easy to get it undone while it's still under pressure. Sheet bend's really good for attaching one end of a rope to another, regardless of the diameters. I think it's a better way of putting it, rather than only for ropes of dissimilar thicknesses. Use a double sheet bend if you need to be a bit stronger, and tuck the bitter end into the lay of the rope if you want to be even more secure again. Then with stopper knots, just a great general figure of 8, good for just stopping a rope running through, so you can leave on the end and still use the rope. As you saw, the Highwayman's Hitch is good if its strength is that you can undo it remotely. That's kind of really, I think, its forte. Everything else is just a bit of a gimmick, to be honest with you. What else did we go through today? That's right, our kind of a Hitches, Clove Hitches. So Clove Hitch was very, its real strength, I think, is the ability to position the rope very accurately, then do the hitch to lock it off. And then things like your round turn and 2 half hitches, I think is good in that you've got half a chance of getting it undone if there is some tension on the rope as well. And then the Anchor Hitch if you're just trying to do something a little bit more securely. Once again though, if you're going to leave something secure and permanent, why not splice and put a thimble in, do it properly, and know it's going to last a lot longer as well. One last thing I will say, that's sort of, once again, a bit peripheral to the knots themselves, is if you're working with ropes, always carry some sort of knife, particularly one with some sort of serration. This is a bit rusty and not great, to be honest with you, so keep them sharp. They always say there's nothing more dangerous than a blunt knife. It's probably true. Because things can go wrong with ropes. People can throw a rope, not realising it's wrapped around their leg. I've had 2 friends lose fingers to ropes. You know, you tie a knot and then suddenly whatever you're dragging, if it's got some weight behind it, fingers get pinched between the rope and the boat. You know, it happens to the best of them. I've seen people, professionals lose fingers that way. A rope under tension will cut pretty easily with a serrated knife, and it can really save someone's life potentially, having a knife around whenever you're working with ropes. Well, thanks for watching. I hope this video helped a bit. It's just a few things I've sort of learnt about knots that perhaps you don't learn from the books and the apps that teach you how to tie the knots. It's great to use those resources to learn the knots, and as I said, I wasn't trying to teach you how to tie them here, but knowing a little bit of the context of tricks to do with them, doing them, undoing them, and when to use them, I think is something worth learning about, you know. Alright, so thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please rate, comment and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. See ya.